Well, let's return now to the Chancellor's latest scheme to support workers forced to remain at home. Rishi Sunak says the government would pay 2/3 of their salaries in a plan expected to cost hundreds of millions of pounds every month. Well, joining us now is Dan Tomlinson, a senior economist at independent think tank, the Resolution Foundation. Good morning to you. What do you make of this latest move by the Chancellor? He has done something of a U-turn, hasn't he? Because the furlough scheme was supposed to be coming to an end.
Yes, good morning. So the Chancellor has called his new scheme an extended job support scheme, which is actually the new scheme that he'd announced just a couple of weeks ago to come in from the 1st of November. But that scheme's actually really different from the thing that he announced yesterday. Yesterday, it's much more like a return to the furlough scheme, and that reflects the fact that we are now really going into a second wave, and the Chancellor's had to change his economic policy quite significantly to reflect the fact that the virus is not going away and we're not in a phase-out phase of our economic support anymore, but instead he's having to ramp things back up so that his economic support matches these quite significant economic restrictions that the government is now, we can see, planning to bring in early next week in large parts of the country. And this scheme will be more targeted than the furlough scheme that has been in place since March, so it will only be for those firms that have been told to close by any of the 4 national governments within the UK. So it isn't like any firm can use this, but it's broadly the same as the one that was implemented back in March.
But there'll also be grants, won't there, for affected firms?
Yes, so he's also had to step up and support businesses in other ways, not just helping them to pay the wages of the staff that are on the books. And both of these interventions are relatively big. So we think there's going to be hundreds of thousands of employees across the country who work in some of those sectors that it sounds like the government's planning on closing, like hospitality and leisure, who will have their pay now again paid through the state. This was a really radical and quite groundbreaking intervention that the Chancellor introduced back in March. In March, the scheme paid 80% of employees' wages while they were sitting at home and not working. Now he's cut that to 2/3, probably to reflect the fact, well, 2 things probably. One, that these schemes are expensive and he's beginning to get worried about the cost of all the intervention. But 2, the fact that there is a really big difference between the amount of support that someone who's on furlough gets, still 66% of their usual wages, and the amount of support that the now growing ranks of the unemployed receive when they're on universal credit. So I think he's also looking to even out the distance between the amount that someone who's furloughed receives and now the unemployed, because that's much lower. And there's also many more people who we now are hearing about are losing their jobs and being made redundant as this crisis continues and businesses continue to struggle.
But what about firms that won't be required to close but will still face further restrictions? They sort of fall through the gap, don't they?
Yeah, and this is where we do think the Chancellor should be thinking really hard now about making a further change to his policies. So he's got these 2 versions of the job support scheme, as he calls them. One for those firms that he's telling to close, and that's where it's basically a return to the furlough of old. But this other scheme that he announced 2 weeks for those firms that are still open is basically, to be frank, quite poorly designed. So its intention was to help firms share work between multiple people. So the state would top up the wages if someone could be brought back to work for at least 1/3 of their pre-coronavirus hours. But within that scheme, he's asking employers to contribute quite a large cost. So to bring someone back on 1/3 of their usual hours would cost an employer 55% of their usual wages. So the incentives just aren't there. So rather than have a scheme that's not very well aligned with what we need to be doing for those businesses that can open, we've called for him to abolish his job retention bonus, which is not very well targeted, and instead spend that money on making his other half of his job support scheme for those firms that are still open much better and much more able to help us keep unemployment down. Because this crisis we've been talking about the risks of rising unemployment for a long time now, and the furlough scheme has done a really good job to date. It's protected, almost 10 million people in terms of their wages and keeping them attached to their employers so they don't lose their jobs. But now unemployment will be set to rise quite sharply, in part because of the weaknesses in his job support scheme for those firms still open. But also it is worth noting that this new scheme for those firms that have been told to close, only those employees that are still on the books will get to use it. So unlike the furlough scheme, businesses aren't going to be able to bring back workers and continue to pay their wages through furlough on this new scheme that the Chancellor has announced yesterday. So unemployment will be rising in the months ahead.
OK, Dan Tomlinson, thank you for your analysis.
Time to see what the weather's going to do for you today, and hopefully a little bit better into tomorrow, Isabel.